It's 4:20 in the afternoon, somewhere over northern France in 1943, and I'm riding inside a B-17 Flying Fortress, pushing through the thin air at 25,000 feet. The engines never stop droning. Oxygen masks hiss in our ears, and frost slowly crawls along the metal frames like it's alive. The radio crackles non-stop. Radar warnings come one after another. German fighters are lifting off, climbing fast, closing the distance. The formation tightens up, not because we want to, but because we have no choice. Up here, there's nowhere to run. Back in the tail, the gunner spots a dark shape rising straight out of the sun. He tracks it, lines it up, and squeezes the trigger on his .50 caliber Browning. Nothing happens. He squeezes again. All he gets is a dry, hollow click. The belt doesn't move. The gun stays dead. The fighter keeps coming. In the air, a jam isn't just a mechanical issue. It's a ticking clock. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Tracer rounds streak past the fuselage, ripping through aluminum like paper. Somewhere inside the plane, a man is already bleeding, and the gun that's supposed to keep him alive stays silent. This isn't some rare fluke. It's happening over and over again, over Germany, over the Channel, over Italy. Our heavy bombers are built to take punishment, but crews are still dying because the last line of defense freezes up, binds, or just quits at altitude. The reports keep stacking higher. Gun jammed at high altitude. Gun jammed after a short burst. Gun jammed under vibration. Every report ends the same way. Fighter attack. Defensive fire reduced. Aircraft lost. 10 men gone. The war machine keeps grinding forward, but something deep inside it is breaking in the cold. On paper, the Browning 50 looks flawless. It's the weapon America trusts everywhere, on tanks, ships, bombers, and ground mounts. It works at sea level. It works in the heat. It works perfectly in training films. But wars aren't fought in training films. They're fought at 25,000 feet, where oil thickens, metal shrinks, springs lose their timing, and tolerances stop forgiving mistakes. Up there, the distance between living and dying isn't measured in minutes. It's measured in the length of one jammed feed. Commanders demand more planes, more missions, more bombs on target. Factories respond. Airfields fill up. Crews climb aboard. And still the guns keep failing. The thinking is simple and dangerous. If the system is big enough, the losses are acceptable. If enough bombers go out, some will always come back. The math looks brutal but efficient, but every jam scratches the same question into the margins of the war. What if the problem isn't the enemy? What if it's the weapon? Far from the roar of engines and flak bursts, down on the ground where nobody hands out medals, someone is reading those reports line by line. Not a pilot, not a general. It's a woman whose hands always smell like oil and solvent, whose world never leaves the hangar floor. She doesn't hear gunfire, but she hears the pattern tearing through the paperwork. Jam, jam, jam. She understands something the sky is trying to say. If the gun goes silent at the same moment every time, then that silence isn't random. It's evidence. And if that evidence is right, then the next battle won't be decided by how many bombers America can build. It'll be decided by whether one person is willing to slow the noise of war down long enough to fix what everyone else keeps rushing past. By early 1943, the pattern isn't just talk anymore. It's numbers. After-action reports from the 8th Air Force in England, the 15th in Italy, and training units back home all start saying the same thing with unsettling precision. Same altitude range, same temperatures, same sequence. A short defensive burst, then silence. Sometimes the gun locks solid. Sometimes the belt twists. Sometimes the bolt stops just shy of battery, close enough to give hope, far enough to get someone killed. The crews write it all down because that's what they've been trained to do. Most of the time, nothing comes of it. The bomber war is growing faster than the system that's supposed to support it. Every morning around 9:30, briefing rooms fill up, maps roll down, target photos appear, weather officers speak in clipped tones, crews are warned to expect heavy opposition, fighters will escort part of the way. After that, we're on our own. The doctrine is simple: tight formations, overlapping fields of fire, mutual defense. The whole idea assumes the guns work. Reality doesn't always agree. The Browning 50 is treated like solved technology. It's been around for years. It's fired millions of rounds in tests. It's earned trust in deserts, jungles, and on ship decks slick with salt water. So when it fails, the first reaction is to blame the man pulling the trigger. Gunners are told to clean more, cycle harder, watch feed angles, adjust technique. Training bulletins get rewritten, checklists grow longer, the losses don't slow down, altitude changes everything. At 25,000 feet, temperatures can drop below 40 below zero. Oil turns thick, almost like wax. Springs lose their snap. Metal contracts just enough to throw timing off by fractions of a second. And those fractions matter. A belt that feeds fine on the ground can hesitate in the cold. A bolt that slams forward at sea level can stall in thin air. None of that shows up in factory tests. Those tests happen where it's warm, controlled, and predictable. War is none of those things. Leadership sees the war in totals: missions flown, bombs dropped, targets destroyed, losses absorbed. A few jammed guns vanish inside spreadsheets marked acceptable attrition. The pressure never lets up. Tomorrow has to see more aircraft in the air than today. Engines, airframes, crews, ammo. Everything has to keep moving. Stopping the system to question a weapon already approved by doctrine feels like heresy. But the crews know better. They know because they live in the thin space between theory and consequences. They know because when a fighter slides into the dead zone off the tail, there's no time to argue doctrine. The gun either fires or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the bomber turns into a slow, predictable target. Formation helps until it breaks. And once one aircraft drops out, the guns that should have protected it are suddenly just trying to save themselves. By mid-year, maintenance depots are drowning. Guns come back with notes scribbled in pencil, jammed at altitude, cause unknown, parts replaced, returned to service. Then it happens again. The assumption hardens into habit. The enemy is good. Losses are unavoidable. The answer is more planes, more men, more production. Quantity becomes the solution to every problem because it's the fastest one available. But there's another way to read the data. Not as noise, but as signal. Not as random failure, but as failure under specific conditions. The jams don't happen everywhere. They happen in certain air, after certain bursts, when the aircraft vibrates at certain frequencies, and that changes everything. I start to realize the gun isn't betraying its design at all. It's doing exactly what it was built to do, just not in the narrow conditions it was truly meant for. The war moved those conditions. The weapon stayed where it was. Down on the ground, where the pace is slower and the noise fades, someone finally begins lining the reports up side by side, not to excuse them, to compare them. She notices what others miss because they're too busy counting totals. The wording changes from report to report. But the situation never does. Cold, altitude, short burst, jam. When I read between the lines, I can hear a mechanical rhythm falling apart under stress. The gun isn't failing at random, it's failing on cue. The resistance to that idea shows up before anyone ever says it out loud. The Browning isn't just a weapon, it's a symbol. And symbols aren't supposed to be questioned in the middle of a war. Talking about lubrication tolerances or feed timing sounds trivial compared to flak bursts and fighter attacks. Small problems are easy to ignore, right up until they kill crews. So the war keeps grinding forward through late afternoon briefings and midnight maintenance shifts. Bombers lift off at 6:15 in the morning and come back at dusk, if they come back at all. Names get crossed off boards. New crews step into the empty spaces. Somewhere between those two moments, the distance between production and survival narrows down to one hard question. If a weapon is trusted everywhere, what happens when it can't be trusted in the one place it matters most? The answer isn't coming from the sky. It's coming from a workbench, a set of tools, and the willingness to slow the war down just long enough to understand why a gun goes silent. She shows up before sunrise and leaves long after the hangar lights dim, moving through the maintenance bay with the quiet confidence of someone who knows every sound a machine should and should not make. Her job title doesn't turn heads. Her clearance is modest. Her name doesn't show up on flight rosters or operations maps. She works where the war is stripped of heroics, reduced to parts spread across oil-stained benches, springs that don't rebound quite right, bolts that hesitate when they shouldn't. While crews brief at 8:15 and engines start warming at 8:40, she's already cycling a gun by hand, feeling resistance through her palms, listening to metal talk back. She didn't end up here by accident. Before the war, she studied mechanics because machines, unlike people, tell the truth if you know how to listen. She learned tolerances, friction, timing, and how a fraction of a second can decide whether motion continues or stops. When the war expanded, she was pulled into the system like thousands of others, tasked with keeping weapons alive so men could stay alive. She doesn't see the targets, she sees the aftermath, bent feed links, scored chambers, springs that return just short of their original length. The evidence arrives by truck and rail, tagged and stacked, each piece a small confession. She reads reports the way others read casualty lists, not for shock, but for pattern. Jammed during defensive fire at altitude, jammed after first burst, jammed in extreme cold. Every unit uses different words. Every crew writes in its own voice. Every officer signs the page differently. But the conditions line up. She starts copying phrases into a notebook she keeps in her coat pocket. Altitude, temperature, duration of fire. She writes them again and again until the repetition becomes impossible to ignore. The war is loud, but around her it speaks in whispers. The tempo never slows. Supervisors push for faster turnarounds. Guns get cleaned, swapped, and shipped back out. No one wants delay. Every pause feels like surrender. When she asks to hold onto a weapon longer for testing, she's told there's no time. When she asks for comparative data, she's told the system already works. The Browning is trusted. It always has been. Trust turns into armor. Doubt turns into a nuisance. She waits, not because she lacks certainty, but because timing matters. In wartime, being right too early can look exactly like being wrong. So she keeps watching. And she notices something important. The guns that jam most often aren't the dirtiest ones. They're the clean ones, the textbook examples, meticulously serviced. She notices that lubrication that works perfectly on the ground behaves differently after hours in thin air. She notices vibration loosens what cold tightens, and tightens what heat once loosened. She notices that a system designed to be forgiving becomes brittle when every margin is squeezed by altitude. One night, after another shipment comes back with the same handwritten note she's already seen a dozen times, she stops calling it coincidence. She lays two guns side by side, identical on paper, identical serial ranges, identical maintenance histories. She chills one, she warms the other. She cycles both slowly, deliberately, by hand. One of them hesitates, just enough to matter. Not every time, not in a way an untrained eye would catch. But to someone paying close attention, the pause is there. A breath held where none should exist. She starts testing in ways the manuals never mention, not to break rules, but to ask questions the rules never imagined. She changes lubrication thickness by temperature. She measures spring response after prolonged cold. She records the exact moment timing slips outside tolerance. Each test is small. Each result looks harmless on its own. Together they form a picture that contradicts everything everyone assumes. The gun isn't failing because it's poorly made. It's failing because the environment changed, and the procedure didn't. There's risk in this, even if it doesn't look like it. Questioning a trusted system during a war can stall careers and close doors fast. She knows that. But she also knows what silence in a tail position means. She's read it too many times. So she builds her case the only way she knows how. Not with opinions, but with evidence that stacks neatly and refuses to be ignored. When she finally speaks, there's no drama, no confrontation. She lays out numbers, conditions, repeatable results. She frames the issue not as failure, but as mismatch. A weapon built for one reality, now being forced to perform in another. She doesn't ask for replacement. She asks for adjustment. A different approach to lubrication, a change in preparation, an acknowledgement that the gun doesn't exist alone, but as part of a system, air temperature, vibration, time. The response is cautious, not because she's wrong, but because she might be right. And if she's right, then men have been dying for a reason that could have been fixed. That's a hard truth to swallow. So the decision is made quietly. No announcements. A small test. A handful of aircraft. The kind of experiment that doesn't threaten doctrine unless it works. As preparations begin, she goes back to her bench, cleans her tools, and writes one last line in her pocket notebook. Not a prediction, a question. If a gun speaks differently in the cold, the real question is whether anyone is willing to listen once it finally starts speaking clearly. If you think equipment failures are just acceptable losses in war, then say that. If you believe one careful observer can change outcomes, say that instead. Pick your side and explain why. The testing doesn't start with aircraft. It starts with patience. That workbench turns into its own battlefield, one measured in thousandths of an inch and fractions of a second. Every assumption gets stripped down until all that's left is motion and resistance. She times the cycle first by feel, then with instruments, counting the subtle delay between pulling the trigger and the bolt reaching full battery. At room temperature, the gun behaves exactly the way doctrine promises. In the cold, it doesn't. The bolt slows just enough to arrive late. The spring returns just short of its intended force. The belt feeds, hesitates, then twists. Not every time, not in a dramatic way, but often enough to matter. She recreates altitude without ever leaving the ground. Ice baths, chilled oil, cold-soaked components left overnight until the metal stops cooperating. One variable changes at a time. Coincidence isn't accepted. When lubrication thickens, timing slips. When timing slips, the feed window narrows. When the window narrows, vibration finishes the job. The gun doesn't fail loudly. It fails quietly, right when noise is most needed. The realization doesn't arrive with drama. It just settles in. The weapon is being prepared for a world that no longer exists. The lubrication written into the manuals was meant to work almost everywhere, but not here. At 25,000 feet, that oil isn't oil anymore. It's a brake. Spring rates that are fine on the ground become marginal when cold steals elasticity. A belt path that's forgiving at sea level becomes unforgiving when tolerances tighten. None of this calls for a redesign. It calls for recalibration. She writes the solution in plain language because plain language travels. Lower viscosity lubricant for cold operations, applied sparingly, only where movement requires it. Tighter spring inspection thresholds. Marginal springs replaced earlier, not later. Pre-flight cycling adjusted for temperature, not habit. She doesn't promise miracles. She promises probability, fewer hesitations, wider margins. Time bought where seconds decide everything. The proposal moves quietly. No speeches, no announcements. A few maintenance chiefs agree to try it on a limited number of aircraft scheduled for a morning mission. At 6:30 a.m., the ramp air bites exposed skin. Guns prepared the old way, and guns prepared the new way sit side by side, impossible to tell apart by sight. The difference isn't visible. It lives in viscosity and patience. Crews climb aboard without knowing which approach they're carrying with them. At 9:40, the formation meets opposition. Fighters test the edges. Defensive arcs overlap. Gunners fire short bursts, then longer ones. In the cold, this is where silence usually creeps in. This time, it doesn't. The guns chatter and keep chattering. The sound isn't heroic, it's just continuous. A mechanic listening from the ground wouldn't hear victory, he'd hear absence. The absence of reports that start with the word jam. The aircraft come back. Some are damaged. None are lost for the reason everyone fears. Maintenance crews pull the guns while they're still cold. There's wear, but it's the kind you expect. No twisted belts, no bolts frozen just short of battery. The logs speak without emotion. Defensive fire sustained. No stoppages reported. One mission doesn't win a war, but it points a direction. The tests expand carefully. Different units, different days, different weather. The preparation stays the same. The environment changes. The result doesn't. Where short bursts once invited failure, they now invite continuation. Where vibration used to finish what cold started, it passes without consequence. The fix isn't dramatic, it's disciplined, and discipline scales. Resistance doesn't disappear. There are arguments about supply chains, standardization, and the danger of stepping outside approved practice. She answers with data, not defiance. She shows that this isn't deviation, it's adaptation. The Browning stays the Browning. Doctrine stays doctrine. Only the details change. And details are where wars are actually fought. By early afternoon briefings, word spreads without ever being announced. Crews notice. Gunners talk. They don't use technical language. They just say the guns feel different. They say the trigger no longer lies. Up in the air, confidence returns, not as bravado, but as steadiness. A gun that works lets a crew focus on flying instead of inventing survival on the spot. There's an unintended effect. Formation discipline improves. When gunners trust their weapons, they hold fire until it matters. Ammunition lasts longer. Fields of fire overlap better. Fighters test and break off sooner. Not because the bombers got bolder, but because uncertainty moved to the other side. The enemy can't count on silence anymore. The solution gets documented and circulated with careful wording: cold weather preparation protocol, revised lubrication guidance, enhanced spring inspection criteria. It reads like maintenance, because that's what it is. No signatures with flourish, no names etched in ink. The war absorbs it and keeps moving. She goes back to her bench. Tools return to their places. The notebook closes. There's no celebration, just the quiet understanding that something small finally lined up with something big. On the next mission, and the one after that, the guns speak when asked. That's the measure, not perfection, reliability. If you believe small adjustments can't change massive systems, say so below. If you believe wars are won in the details no one wants to slow down for, say that instead. Like the video if you disagree with the idea that preparation matters more than firepower. Subscribe if you think quiet fixes deserve to be remembered. Nothing is announced. There's no briefing slide promising the guns will work today. Crews climb aboard at 5:45 like always. Boots ring against metal. Breath fogs in the cold. Engines turn over. The formation lifts and bends toward hostile airspace. The air is thin, brittle, unforgiving. This is where the difference either shows or it doesn't. There's no middle ground. At 10:10 contrails cut the sky and the first contacts appear. Fighters probe fast and cautious, testing reaction time. The tail gunner tracks a shadow and squeezes the trigger. The gun answers immediately. A short burst, then another, then a sustained stream when the angle demands it. There's no pause to clear a stoppage, no frantic hand reaching for a charging handle. The sound stays alive. The fighter breaks away, not because it's been hit, but because the opening it expected never appears. Across the formation, the same thing happens in different firing arcs. Waist guns stay active together. Top turrets engage without hesitation. The rhythm changes. Where defensive fire once arrived in stutters, now it arrives as pressure, continuous, overlapping, confident. The enemy adjusts. Attacks start farther out. Passes get shorter. Angles soften. This isn't guesswork. It's observed. Pilots write it down. Gunners feel it in their bones. The space around the formation grows as fighters reassess the risk. At 11:20, flak starts climbing. Black bursts rise and drift across the sky. The bombers hold their course. This is usually where tension breaks discipline, where small failures pile up fast. This time, the guns keep talking. The effect isn't loud. It's cumulative. The gunners aren't fighting their equipment anymore. They're fighting the fight. You can hear it in their voices, see it in their posture. Commands get repeated calmly instead of shouted. The formation comes home in the early afternoon. Some aircraft are damaged. None are missing for reasons tied to defensive failure. Maintenance crews pull the guns while they're still cold to the touch. They search for the old signatures, twisted belts, scored feedways, bolts frozen just shy of battery. They don't find them. What they find is where that makes sense, where that comes from use, not betrayal. The reports come in that evening. They're short. Defensive fire sustained, no stoppages. Enemy fighters disengaged earlier than expected. The language stays careful. Nobody declares victory after one day, but the pattern holds. The next mission, then the one after that. Different weather, different routes, same result. The silence that used to kill crews doesn't come back. Enemy behavior shifts. Intercepts grow cautious. Head-on passes replace tail chases. Fighters break off sooner. They probe less deeply into overlapping fields of fire. Not because the bombers are faster or higher, but because the cost of closing has gone up. A weapon that works consistently changes the math without changing the doctrine. Loss rates don't collapse overnight. Wars almost never turn on a dime. But the curve bends. It flattens where it used to climb. Aircraft come back with holes that would have been fatal if a gun had gone quiet. Crews debrief with a different tone. No bragging, just observation. "The gun's fired when called upon." That sentence starts showing up again and again. There's an effect nobody predicted. Morale steadies. When crews trust their equipment, they stop wasting mental energy on what might fail. Decisions under pressure improve. Formation discipline tightens. Bomb release timing sharpens. The mission becomes what it was meant to be. Not a gamble stacked with uncertainty. Reliability doesn't win wars by itself, but unreliability can lose them fast. Word spreads the way it always does in combat units. Not through orders, but through experience. Gunners talk to gunners. Crew chiefs compare notes. The preparation spreads faster than paperwork can follow. By the time official guidance catches up, the practice is already standard. The system adapts not because it's told to, but because it feels safer. Late in the afternoon, after engines wind down and crews climb out stiff and exhausted, fresh reports get pinned to a board. No names, no theories, just outcomes, fewer stoppages, sustained fire, successful return. Every line traces back to a choice made earlier on the ground. Every line represents time bought in the air. The enemy notices, too. Intelligence summaries start mentioning altered attack profiles, shorter engagement windows, increased standoff distance. The bomber stream was never invulnerable, but now it's no longer predictable. The quiet advantage of reliability forces a recalculation on both sides. As evening settles and the hangars empty, the bench goes quiet again. Tools get cleaned, parts logged. There's no ceremony for fixes that work, just repetition, day after day, mission after mission. The solution doesn't announce itself, it proves itself. If you think combat outcomes are shaped more by courage than preparation, say so below. If you believe trust in equipment changes how people fight, share why. Like the video if you disagree with the idea that reliability is a weapon. Subscribe if you think small fixes can carry long reach. The effect never arrives as a headline. It arrives as accumulation. One mission where more aircraft come home intact. Another where formations hold together longer under pressure. Another where enemy fighters break off earlier than expected. Each one alone means little. Together they start bending the arithmetic of the air war. By mid-1943, planners notice something subtle in the tallies. Sorties remain high, bombs dropped keep rising. But losses tied to fighter interception begin to level off in units using the revised preparation. They don't vanish, they level. In a war built on attrition, that difference matters. Every aircraft that returns can fly again. Every crew that survives carries experience forward, and experience compounds faster than replacements ever can. The real value of a heavy bomber was never just its payload. It was the system wrapped around it, training pipelines, maintenance hours, crew coordination that took months to build and seconds to lose. When defensive guns fail, that investment disappears instantly. When they work reliably, it stays in circulation. Commanders start to see survivability differently, not just as protection, but as production efficiency by another name. Enemy tactics adapt again. Late summer intelligence notes new patterns, probing attacks from farther out, head-on passes instead of long-tail chases, shorter engagement windows, more ammunition spent for less return. None of it removes the threat, it reshapes it. A predictable bomber is easy to plan against. An unpredictable one forces hesitation, and hesitation costs opportunity. The effect ripples outward. Escort fighters get freed to disrupt instead of rescue. When bombers can hold their defensive perimeter longer, escorts can engage instead of babysit. The sky grows less crowded with emergencies and more contested on chosen terms. This isn't doctrine rewritten. It's doctrine made possible by reliability. Production priorities shift quietly. The question stops being only how many aircraft can be built this month. It becomes how many can still be flying next month. Maintenance guidance grows more precise, and the war keeps moving forward, changed, not by noise but by details. Cold weather kits become standardized. Lubricants start getting issued with real care instead of routine habit. Spring tolerances are tracked more closely and replaced sooner. None of that sounds like grand strategy on its own. But multiplied across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of missions, it becomes strategy, whether anyone intended it to or not. The enemy notices. Reports start noting that bomber formations aren't shedding aircraft around the edges as easily anymore. Losses still happen, but they're harder earned. Fighters have to push deeper into the formation, stay exposed longer, accept more risk from overlapping fire. That risk adds up, too. Some pilots adapt, some don't make it back. The balance shifts, not because anyone found a miracle, but because one side stopped bleeding from a weakness it had been inflicting on itself. There's a philosophical shift that follows. The air war had been framed as a contest of mass. Who could put more metal in the sky? Who could absorb more losses? But mass without reliability collapses under its own weight. As months pass, the evidence gets harder to dismiss. A modest improvement repeated thousands of times can outweigh a spectacular breakthrough used only once in a while. The war rewards consistency more than brilliance. Inside the system, attitudes begin to change. Engineers and maintenance crews gain quiet leverage. Their voices carry more weight when they come with results attached. The distance between the hangar floor and the operations board narrows, not because rank disappears, but because survival clarifies priorities. A bomber that comes home intact is an argument no one wants to ignore. The woman who started this chain reaction never shows up in the summaries. Her work gets absorbed into procedures stripped of names. That's how large systems protect themselves. They turn people into processes. The victory, if it deserves that word, belongs to no one and everyone at the same time. The guns fire when asked. The formations hold. Missions keep rolling. By late afternoon briefings, the language changes, not loudly, but noticeably. Losses are discussed as variables, not constants. Survivability starts getting treated as adjustable, not fixed. That's a dangerous idea in wartime, but it's also a necessary one, because it implies responsibility. If outcomes can be improved, then failure isn't inevitable anymore. It's something to be examined. The strategic impact doesn't show up in days. It shows up in campaigns, in aircraft still flying months later, in crews who turn into veterans instead of names on boards, in pressure applied steadily instead of in bursts cut short by silence. The guns don't win the war. They allow the war to be fought on terms that favor endurance. If you believe wars are decided by single decisive inventions, say so. If you believe they're decided by small corrections, repeated until they turn into advantage, explain why. Like the video, if you disagree with the idea that strategy lives in maintenance manuals, subscribe if you think endurance is built one fix at a time. When wars end, stories harden into shapes people can remember. Victories get faces, defeats get villains, Machines turn into symbols. The space in between, where most of the war actually lived, starts to disappear. The bombers are remembered. The pilots are remembered. The names painted on noses survive in photographs. The details that kept those aircraft alive long enough to earn those photos usually don't. What happened on the hangar floor doesn't fit neatly into myth. There's no single moment where the sky explodes and everything changes. There's only repetition, one careful adjustment, one procedure followed correctly, one failure that doesn't happen again and again. War gets explained as a contest of will. But will can't overcome a weapon that refuses to function. Courage can't compensate for silence at the wrong second. Survival, in the end, depends on whether the system respects reality. The woman at the center of this story never becomes a legend. She doesn't appear on posters or in victory reels. Her contribution dissolves into routine, into checklists, habits, and expectations that future crews will assume were always there. That's both the cost and the proof of success. When a fix works well enough, no one remembers the problem. The absence of failure becomes invisible. That raises an uncomfortable question about how wars are understood. If outcomes are shaped by thousands of small decisions instead of a few dramatic ones, then responsibility is spread just as widely. Losses once dismissed as unavoidable start to look preventable. And that realization is hard to sit with. It suggests that some deaths weren't the price of war itself, but the price of ignoring signals that were inconvenient to hear. There's a temptation to frame this as a story about recognition or injustice. It isn't. It's a story about attention, about what happens when someone refuses to treat noise as randomness. The guns didn't jam because fate demanded it. They jammed because physics doesn't care about doctrine. Cold thickens oil, metal contracts, springs weaken. Those aren't opinions. They're facts. War punishes anyone who pretends otherwise. The lesson reaches beyond this one weapon and this one conflict. Large systems fail quietly before they fail catastrophically. They warn in patterns that are easy to dismiss if no one is assigned to listen. In war, speed outruns reflection. In peace, complacency replaces urgency. In both, small failures pile up until they're no longer small. What saved lives here wasn't innovation in the heroic sense. It was humility, the willingness to accept that a trusted solution no longer fit a changed reality. The willingness to slow down just enough to see what was actually happening instead of what was supposed to be happening. That kind of thinking rarely earns applause, but it builds endurance. And endurance wins wars more often than brilliance ever does. The bombers kept flying. The guns kept firing. Crews came home who otherwise might not have. The war moved on and eventually ended, like all wars do. What remained wasn't a single decisive moment, but a quiet correction folded into history. A reminder that behind every crew that survives is a chain of choices made by people who never left the ground. If you believe war is shaped only by those who fight on the front line, say so in the comments. If you believe it's also shaped by those who notice what others rush past, share your view. Like the video if you disagree with the idea that small details matter. Subscribe if you think the invisible stories deserve to be remembered.